Captain Elias Ward stared out of the small window of his damaged ship, his heart pounding as the alien planet below him seemed to rush up fast. His ship's engines had failed completely after a sudden strike from space debris, and now he was on a strange, hostile world, with only his wits to rely on. The ship crashed into the thick forests of this strange planet, making a loud noise that echoed through the trees. Elias winced from the sudden impact, but he knew he couldn't stay there long. The crash had drawn attention, and if the local creatures were anything like the ones he read about in the planet's data logs, he'd be in serious trouble. After gathering a few survival supplies, he stepped out of the ship, careful not to disturb the ship's fragile systems more than necessary. The air was thick with an unknown scent, a mix of damp earth and something else that reminded him of wet fur. The planet's sky was a strange greenish hue, unlike anything he had ever seen before. Elias didn't have time to be amazed by the landscape. He needed to find shelter, or better yet, figure out how to fix the ship and leave before anything dangerous found him. But just as he started to move, the ground beneath him shook. Elias froze. It wasn't just a tremor. This was something big, something alive. He turned to look in the direction of the sound, and his heart skipped a beat. A massive creature was coming toward him. The creature was unlike anything he had ever seen. It stood on 4 thick legs, its body covered in scales that shimmered in the sunlight. The creature's head was like a dragon's, long and sharp, with glowing red eyes locked onto him. Its long tail swung behind it like a whip, and every step it took made the earth tremble. Elias instinctively took a step back, his mind racing. He was trained for space exploration, not combat with enormous alien creatures. But there was no running. There was nowhere to hide. The creature was too fast, and it was already too close. With no choice left, Elias took a deep breath and stood tall. He remembered the emergency training drills he had gone through. Stay calm, observe, and figure out a way to communicate. He raised his hand slowly, showing he meant no harm, and took a small step forward. The creature stopped in its tracks. It sniffed the air, its eyes narrowing as it studied Elias. Its massive body tensed, ready to pounce. Elias held his breath, wondering if this was the end. But then something strange happened. Elias, remembering his old studies about animal behavior, started to speak softly, in a calm and even tone. He didn't know why he was doing it, but he figured it couldn't hurt. He spoke gently, telling the creature to stay calm and no harm. His words were nothing more than a whisper, but to his surprise, the creature seemed to understand. It tilted its head slightly, still watching him closely, but it didn't move. Elias slowly crouched down, keeping his eyes on the creature, showing that he was unthreatening. He tried to lower his heartbeat, as his instincts told him that the creature would attack if it sensed fear. He had to stay calm, to stay strong. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The creature continued to stare, its glowing red eyes piercing the air between them. Elias was unsure how much time had passed. It felt like hours, but in reality, it had only been a few minutes. Then, without warning, the creature took a step closer. Elias's breath caught in his throat, but instead of attacking, the creature lowered its massive head, bringing it closer to Elias. Elias didn't move. His heart was racing, but he kept his focus. He extended his hand cautiously toward the creature's head, his palm facing up. If it wanted to attack, it would do so now. The creature's eyes flickered with curiosity. Slowly, and with a surprisingly gentle motion, it nudged its head toward Elias's hand, sniffing him lightly. Elias's fingers brushed against the creature's scales, and a strange, tingling sensation spread through his arm. It wasn't pain. It was something else, something almost like recognition. Elias froze for a moment, unsure what was happening, but the creature didn't react aggressively. It simply stood there, allowing Elias to touch its scales. Then, after a few more moments of silence, the creature backed away, taking a few steps back, still watching him. Elias blinked in disbelief. The creature, which just moments ago had seemed like it was ready to rip him apart, now seemed calm. He couldn't explain it. There was no way this should have worked. No human should be able to communicate with such a creature, especially not this easily. Before Elias could even process what had happened, a voice echoed from behind him. "Well, well, well. What do we have here?" He turned quickly, his heart still pounding in his chest. A woman, tall and strong, stepped out from behind a nearby tree. Her skin had an unusual light blue hue, and her eyes were sharp and golden, like an animal's. She wore armor made of strange materials that Elias didn't recognize. She looked as if she belonged to this world, like she was part of the landscape itself. She looked at him in astonishment. "How did you do that?" she asked, her voice full of disbelief. "How did you tame my dragon, human?" Elias took a moment to catch his breath. He had no idea what to say. He didn't understand what had just happened either. All he could do was stand there, staring at the woman and the creature behind her. I don't know," Elias replied, still trying to process everything. "I just stayed calm. I guess it worked." The woman stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke again, this time in a much more serious tone. "You're either brave, foolish, or something else entirely," she said, "but you will have to explain yourself to the council. We don't trust outsiders, especially not ones who can tame dragons." Elias's mind was racing as he realized the situation he had stumbled into. This alien world was far from welcoming, and he had no idea what to expect next. But one thing was clear: this was only the beginning. Elias stood frozen, still processing the events that had just unfolded before him. He had barely survived the crash, only to find himself face to face with a dragon, a creature that no one had ever imagined could be tamed by a human. And now, a fierce-looking alien woman was staring at him as if he had just performed the impossible. The woman's eyes, sharp and intense, watched Elias with both curiosity and suspicion. Her long braided hair swayed slightly in the wind, and her powerful frame, wrapped in armored gear, made her look both graceful and dangerous. She crossed her arms, standing tall, waiting for an answer. Elias opened his mouth to speak, but his mind was racing. He still didn't fully understand what had happened. He wasn't a warrior, nor a dragon expert. His background was in communication and understanding alien life forms. He had never expected his calm demeanor to have such an effect on the wild creature. The fact that he had just tamed it seemed impossible. The woman raised an eyebrow. "You did not speak to it," she said in a voice laced with disbelief. "You did not use weapons. So how did you make it stop?" Elias took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts. "I didn't use anything. I just spoke to it." Calmly. "I don't know why it worked," he replied honestly. The woman stared at him for a long moment, her golden eyes scanning his every movement. She seemed to be calculating something, weighing his words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke again. "I am Commander Soria of the Drakari. You are not like the others who come here, others who die without ever understanding this world." Elias, still trying to gather his thoughts, nodded. "I didn't come here to cause trouble. I just need to fix my ship and leave. But I had no idea what kind of creatures lived here. Your dragon, it reacted to me." Soria took a step closer, examining him more carefully. "You are not from here. You speak differently, look different. You are human." Elias could tell she wasn't just curious. She was cautious, studying him, trying to figure out what kind of threat he might be. The Drakari, from what he understood, were a race that valued strength and pride above all else. To have a human stand before her, seemingly able to communicate with a creature as dangerous as the dragon, must have been both fascinating and confusing. "I'm from Earth," Elias said, trying to make his explanation simple. "Humans have learned how to communicate with animals back home. We've studied behavior for centuries. I guess I just tried what I've read about. Listening in staying calm. I didn't know it would work on a creature like that. Soria didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned toward the dragon, which was still standing a short distance away. The creature had backed off, but it remained close, watching Elias carefully. Its glowing red eyes were now much softer, though still filled with curiosity. "He is not like the others," Soria muttered. "He is wild, untamable. Even we, the Drakari, have failed to train him fully. He has a spirit that is too strong." Elias, now more curious than ever, asked, "What do you mean, untamable? Does your race train all the dragons?" Soria nodded, but there was a touch of sadness in her expression. "We ride dragons, yes. They are our partners in battle, our companions in life. But the bond we share is one of control. We control them with strength and dominance. For thousands of years, the Drakari have fought with dragons, and in that time, we have learned that only the strongest survive. Control is everything." Elias thought for a moment, then asked, "So you don't think it's possible to communicate with them without using force?" Soria's eyes narrowed. "That is not how we live. We do not talk to our dragons like pets. They are warriors, and we are warriors. Only the most powerful can ride them. To tame a dragon without strength, without control, it is unheard of." Elias felt a sense of deep understanding. The Drakari had spent so much time relying on force, on power, that they had never considered a different way. He could see that Soria was struggling with this idea, perhaps even questioning everything she had been taught. "I didn't mean to disrespect your traditions," Elias said carefully, "but I believe that understanding each other, even with something as wild as a dragon, is the key. Maybe there's another way, a way where both humans and dragons could live in harmony, without domination." Soria didn't speak immediately. She was deep in thought, her gaze shifting between Elias and the dragon. The creature, though still watchful, didn't seem as aggressive now. It almost looked curious, as if waiting to see what would happen next. After a long silence, Soria finally turned back to Elias. "You speak with such certainty, but you do not know the ways of the Drakari. You do not understand the honor of the battle, of the bond between dragon and rider." Elias met her gaze and smiled softly. "I understand that honor. But I also believe that there is strength in trust, in respect, and that's something the Drakari might be missing. Maybe we can find a way to share that." Soria paused again, her expression unreadable. Elias could tell that the idea of changing everything the Drakari had known for centuries was not something she was willing to accept easily. But just as Elias was about to speak again, a loud roar broke the silence. The dragon, who had been standing quietly beside them, suddenly stepped forward with a growl. It was clear that it wasn't fully comfortable with this conversation either. It took a few threatening steps toward Elias, its eyes flashing bright red. Soria stepped between the two. "Stay back," she said firmly, her voice commanding. "He is still not ready. He is too wild for your methods." Elias raised his hands in a calm gesture, trying to show that he meant no harm. The dragon, sensing the tension, hesitated, but its eyes stayed fixed on Elias. It was a test, Elias realized, a test of will and trust. But the real question was, could he truly tame a dragon without using force? Elias stood at the edge of the clearing, watching as Commander Soria paced back and forth. Her eyes never left him, studying his every movement. The dragon behind her, the creature he had somehow calmed just hours earlier, was now staring at him with cold, calculating eyes. Elias felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding anymore. He had challenged the very core of the Drakari way of life. The idea of taming a dragon without using strength or dominance was nothing short of blasphemy to their culture. To them, dragons were wild beasts, and only the strongest could control them. "I can see the doubt in your eyes, human," Soria said, her voice cutting through the tension. "You think that what you did with my dragon was easy. But you are wrong. You have not earned your place here. You have not earned the right to be in the presence of dragons. Elias's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood tall. His hands, still slightly shaking from his earlier encounter with the dragon, were now steady. He had never been one to back down from a challenge, especially one that involved something he believed in. And he believed in the idea of trust, not force. "I'm not here to take anything from you," Elias said firmly, looking Soria directly in the eyes. "I just want to understand. I want to show that there's another way." Soria's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Understanding is not enough. To be a Drakari, you must prove yourself in battle. Only then can you claim the respect of our people." Elias blinked, surprised by her words. "Battle," he repeated, his voice steady but full of confusion. "But I'm not a warrior. I'm not here to fight you." "You misunderstand," Soria said, stepping closer. "It is not me you must fight, human. It is the dragons. If you want to show that your way works, you must face the challenge head-on. Only the strong can tame a dragon. That is our way." Elias's mind raced. This was no longer about just calming a creature. This was about proving himself, about changing an entire culture's belief system. He wasn't sure if he could do it, but he also couldn't let the opportunity slip by. If he truly wanted to help, he had to go all in. He nodded slowly. "All right, I'll face the dragons, but not in the way you think." Soria's eyes narrowed. "You think you can outsmart them? Do you think your words are enough to make them bow to you?" She let out a sharp laugh. "You will learn that words are useless in the face of a dragon's power." "I don't believe that," Elias replied, his voice calm. "I believe that dragons, like any creature, have their own fears, their own needs. They don't need to be controlled. They need to be understood." Soria didn't say anything for a long moment. She was still processing his words, but Elias could see that she wasn't convinced. "Very well," she said finally. "If you think your way is right, then you must prove it. There is a sacred ground where dragons test those who wish to bond with them. Go there and face the trial of fire. Only then will you have a chance to earn their trust." Elias took a deep breath. The trial of fire sounded like nothing he'd ever experienced. But there was no turning back now. He had to do this. For the dragons, for himself. The next morning, Soria led Elias through a dense forest, the air thick with mist. The path ahead was rugged and twisted, and Elias had to concentrate on every step, careful not to trip over the roots that seemed to reach out from the earth. It felt like the very forest itself was watching them, waiting for something. After hours of walking, they finally arrived at a large clearing. In the center, there was a pit filled with swirling fire, the flames rising and falling in a rhythmic dance. The heat from the fire was intense, but Elias didn't flinch. Instead, he took a deep breath and stepped forward. Soria followed, but kept her distance. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She knew this was a test, and she wasn't going to make it easier for him. "This is the trial of fire," Soria said, her voice low. "The dragon must decide if it will accept you. If you fail, you will not survive." Elias nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. But he wasn't afraid. He had faced worse challenges in his life, and he had learned that fear could be a powerful enemy. If he was going to survive this, he had to trust himself and trust the method he believed in. He turned toward the pit, his eyes scanning the area around him. No dragon appeared. For a moment, he wondered if he had miscalculated. But then, from the shadows, he saw two red eyes glowing in the distance. The dragon from before stepped forward, its massive form looming in the center of the clearing. The creature's scales shimmered in the light of the fire, and its wings stretched wide, blocking the sunlight. Soria was right. This was a test. The dragon would not make it easy for him. Elias took a deep breath. He knew that force would not work. He had to be calm. He had to be patient. Slowly, he stepped forward, his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. I don't want to fight you, Elias said, his voice steady. I just want to understand you. You don't have to fight me. We don't have to fight each other. The dragon growled, the sound vibrating through the air. But Elias didn't back down. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. I know you're powerful, Elias continued, his voice calm and clear. I know you're wild, but that doesn't mean you have to be alone. The dragon snorted, its hot breath washing over Elias. He could feel the heat from the fire, but he didn't flinch. He kept his eyes locked on the dragon's. The creature seemed to hesitate, as if weighing his words. After what felt like an eternity, the dragon lowered its head. It wasn't defeated. It wasn't controlled, but it was acknowledging Elias. It was listening. Elias reached out slowly, carefully, and placed his hand on the dragon's scaled head. It was a small gesture, but it was enough. Elias had earned the dragon's trust. Behind him, Soria watched in stunned silence. She had seen many warriors fail this test. Yet here was a human, someone who had never known the bond between Drakari and dragon, standing before the creature with nothing but trust and respect. She had expected Elias to fail. She had expected him to fall. But instead, he had shown her something different. A new way. The dragon stood still, its massive head gently resting under Elias's hand. The heat from its scales radiated against his skin, but Elias felt no fear. Instead, there was a strange, peaceful connection, something he couldn't explain but deeply felt. It was as though the dragon had accepted him, not as an enemy or intruder, but as something more. Soria stood at a distance, watching with a mixture of surprise and disbelief. She had expected Elias to fail the trial of fire. Most did, even among the Drakari. Only those with the greatest strength could face a dragon and survive. But here was a human, standing in front of the most powerful creature on their planet, with no weapons, no strength, only calm words and respect. Elias gently withdrew his hand from the dragon's head. The creature raised its head slightly, watching him with those piercing red eyes. There was still a certain wariness in its gaze, but it no longer felt like a dangerous, untamable beast. Instead, it felt like a creature that had simply been misunderstood, like it was waiting for someone to listen. Soria slowly stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she approached Elias. I didn't expect this, she said quietly. Her voice was no longer filled with the harsh skepticism she had shown before. Instead, there was a hint of curiosity in her tone. Elias nodded, still feeling the heat from the dragon's scales. Neither did I, he admitted. But I think this is the way it's meant to be. Soria's golden eyes studied him carefully. The Drakari believe in strength. We have always believed that only the strong deserve to bond with the dragons. But you? She trailed off, shaking her head in confusion. You don't have the strength of a warrior, and yet you did what no one else has done. Elias glanced back at the dragon. It wasn't attacking, it wasn't retreating. It was simply there, standing tall, as if waiting for the next step in the strange connection they had formed. I believe there's more than just physical strength, Elias said, his voice calm but filled with certainty. I think strength can come in other forms, like trust, patience, and respect. If we only rely on force, we miss out on so much. Soria didn't respond immediately. She looked at Elias for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, she looked at the dragon once again. The creature's eyes softened, and it took a step closer, as if it was comfortable around Elias now. This is, Soria's voice was low, almost uncertain. This is something I never thought possible. Elias smiled. It's possible because we're willing to try something new. Maybe the Drakari have been wrong all this time. Maybe there's a better way for dragons and humans to exist together. Soria was quiet for a long time, still processing what Elias had just said. Elias could see the inner conflict within her. She had grown up in a world where strength and control were the only means of survival. But here, in front of him and the dragon, that world seemed to be changing. I need to show this to the council, Soria said finally, her voice firm but respectful. They will want to know what happened here. They will want to decide whether this new way is something we can accept. Elias nodded. I understand. But I'm not asking you to change your entire way of life right away. I just want to show that there's another path, a way that doesn't rely on domination and control. Soria turned to leave, motioning for Elias to follow her. The dragon, still standing behind them, let out a soft rumble, as if approving of their decision. The journey back to the Drakari stronghold was long and quiet. Elias kept his distance from Soria, but he could sense the shift in the air. She had gone from being cold and dismissive to being more thoughtful, more open. Perhaps she was beginning to see that there was more to life than just power and strength. When they arrived at the stronghold, Elias was led into a large chamber, the walls lined with ancient symbols and murals depicting dragons and warriors. The council was waiting for them, a group of high-ranking Drakari elders. They were seated on elevated stone platforms, their eyes piercing as they observed the newcomers. Soria stepped forward, her gaze shifting between Elias and the council. Elders, I bring before you Elias Ward, a human who has done what no other has done before. He has faced our dragon and earned its trust without using force. The elders murmured among themselves, exchanging uncertain glances. Elias could feel the weight of their judgment bearing down on him. This was the moment he had feared, the moment when everything could go wrong. One of the elders, a tall Drakari with silver hair, stepped forward. His eyes were sharp, filled with years of experience and wisdom. You claim that this human has tamed our dragon, he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Soria nodded. Yes, he did not fight. He did not dominate. He simply spoke to it and earned its trust. The elder studied Elias carefully, his gaze penetrating. How do you explain this? We have always believed that only the strong can earn the respect of a dragon. And yet, here you stand, without the strength of a warrior, claiming you've done the impossible. Elias stepped forward, standing tall but with respect. I don't claim to be strong in the way you're used to. But I believe strength doesn't just come from power. It can come from understanding, from patience, from listening. If we rely only on force, we'll never understand the true power of a dragon or any living being. The elder didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on Elias, searching for any sign of weakness. But Elias stood firm. He knew that he couldn't force the council to accept him, but he could at least show them the truth of his beliefs. Finally, the elder nodded slowly. You have given us much to consider, human, but your path is not yet clear. We will decide your fate after further examination. Elias's heart skipped a beat. This was only the beginning. He had made a small step, but there was still much to prove. As the council continued to deliberate, Elias glanced at Soria. She stood beside him, her expression unreadable. But there was something different in her eyes now. A flicker of hope, perhaps. Maybe, just maybe, this new path could work. And with that thought, Elias knew that the fight for a better future, one where dragons and humans could live in harmony, was far from over. The air inside the council chamber was thick with tension. Elias could feel the weight of the elders' gaze on him, their eyes sharp and critical. The tall stone walls of the room seemed to close in as the silence stretched on. Each elder deep in thought, considering the implications of what Elias had done. The room was filled with the low murmur of whispers, the only light coming from the glowing symbols on the walls. Elias stood motionless, trying to steady his breathing. He knew the council's decision could change everything for him. For all of them. If they accepted his approach, if they believed that a new path was possible, it could mean peace and understanding between humans and dragons. But if they rejected him, if they decided that his way was a threat to their way of life, the consequences would be far worse than anything he had faced before. Beside him, Soria stood silently, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She had been quiet since they had entered the chamber. He could sense that she was torn between her loyalty to her people and the strange new ideas that Elias had presented. She had seen the change in the dragon, but would the elders see it too? Finally, after what felt like hours, the elder with silver hair, who had questioned Elias earlier, stood up. The room fell silent immediately. His gaze locked on Elias, his face stern and weathered with age, his eyes deep and thoughtful. "You claim to have tamed a dragon without using force," the elder began, his voice commanding. "You claim that trust and respect are enough to bridge the gap between our kind and these wild creatures. But the Drakari have always relied on strength. We have always controlled the dragons. We have fought wars and won battles with their power at our side. You ask us to abandon all that?" Elias nodded, his voice steady but filled with passion. "I don't ask you to abandon anything. I'm not asking you to give up your warriors, your traditions, or your honor. What I'm asking for is a chance to try something different, a chance to show that there is more to strength than force. We can still be strong, together." The elder's eyes narrowed, studying Elias closely. "And you think this can work with every dragon? Even the most wild, the most untamable?" Elias took a deep breath, carefully choosing his words. "I don't think every dragon will accept this way. Some will be too set in their ways, too wild. But I believe that most dragons, if given the opportunity, would respond to kindness, to understanding. That's all I did. I didn't try to control it. I just listened." The elder raised an eyebrow. "And you think that your words can do what thousands of years of strength have failed to do? That we can abandon the power of the dragon, the force we've relied on for generations, for a method that is unknown?" "Yes," Elias said, his voice growing more confident. "I believe that the world is changing. The ways of the past aren't always the answer. You can still have strength, but it doesn't have to come at the cost of trust and respect." There was a long silence in the room. As the council members exchanged glances, Elias couldn't read their expressions. Were they considering his words? Were they seeing the possibilities, or were they simply rejecting him as an outsider who didn't understand their culture? Soria, who had been standing quietly beside Elias, finally stepped forward. Her voice, once filled with skepticism, now had a tone of respect. "Elders, I've seen what Elias can do. I've seen the bond he has created with the dragon. I've watched him face it without fear, without aggression. This is something I never expected. The way we have lived with dragons has always been about control. But Elias has shown me another path. Perhaps it is worth considering." The elder with silver hair remained silent for a moment, his gaze shifting from Soria to Elias, and back again. "You speak of trust and respect. These are not things we have ever had to rely on in our battles. But you are not the first to challenge our traditions. I have seen many come and go, all promising to bring change. And yet, our way has always remained the same." Elias swallowed, feeling the weight of the moment. "I'm not asking to replace your way. I'm asking for a chance to prove that there is a better way. A way where dragons and humans can live in peace without fighting for control." The elder studied Elias carefully, as though weighing his very soul. Finally, he nodded slowly, signaling for the council to quiet down. "Perhaps," the elder said, his voice thoughtful, "it is time to consider something new. You speak of peace, but we must see it for ourselves. A trial, then. We will not simply take your word for it. You will prove your claim. You will face our greatest dragon, the one who has never allowed a rider. If you can tame it without force, if you can show us that your method truly works, then we will listen." Elias felt his heart race. He had thought the trial with the first dragon had been the hardest test he would face. But this was something else. This was a dragon that had never been controlled by anyone. No one, not even the Drakari, had succeeded in taming it. Soria looked at him, her eyes filled with concern. "This dragon is more dangerous than the one you faced. It is wild and untamed. It has never accepted a rider." Elias met her gaze, a calm resolve settling over him. "I didn't come here to fight. I didn't come here to force anything. I'm going to show them Soria, I'm going to show them that there's another way. Soria hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. If you truly believe this can work, then I will stand with you. But know this, Elias, this dragon is unlike any other. It will not be easy. Elias gave a small smile. I didn't expect it to be. As the council began to prepare for the trial, Elias felt a sense of both fear and determination. This was it. This was his chance to prove that his method could work. But the stakes were higher than ever before. If he failed, not only would he lose his chance to change the Drakari way of life, but he might never leave this world alive. The path ahead was uncertain, but Elias knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to give up without a fight. This was more than just a test for dragons. It was a test for humanity itself. The sun was setting as Elias stood at the edge of the Drakari stronghold, overlooking the vast, rocky plains that stretched out before him. The wind was cool, biting at his skin, but he didn't feel the cold. His thoughts were far away, focused entirely on the task ahead. The trial, the ultimate test, was coming. The greatest dragon the Drakari had ever known awaited him. And this time, there would be no turning back. Beside him, Soria stood in silence. Her golden eyes were troubled, and her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. She had explained what Elias was about to face, but no words could truly prepare him for the creature he was about to encounter. It wasn't just a dragon. It was a symbol of everything the Drakari had believed for generations. It was untamable, unpredictable, and feared by all. I didn't want you to face this, Soria said quietly, her voice soft but filled with concern. This dragon has been the subject of so many stories, so many failed attempts. No one has ever succeeded, not even the fiercest of warriors. Elias turned to look at her, his expression calm but determined. I understand, but I can't change anything if I don't try. This is the only way I can prove that there's another path. Soria took a deep breath and nodded. I just don't want you to get hurt. If the dragon rejects you, it will not show mercy. Elias gave a small smile, trying to ease her worry. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to listen. She studied him for a moment longer, then finally stepped back. Then go. The council is waiting. They're expecting you. Elias nodded, turning back toward the open plains. His heart was steady, his resolve unshakable. This was his moment. This was the chance to show that strength didn't have to mean domination. He could earn the dragon's trust through respect, not force. The journey ahead would be difficult, but Elias was ready. As he walked into the open space, the wind howled around him, carrying the scent of the wilderness. His steps were slow but purposeful. He had no weapons, no armor, only the lessons he had learned from his first encounter with the dragon. The lesson that listening and respecting was the key to understanding. The great dragon was waiting, perched atop a jagged cliff at the far end of the plain. Its massive wings were folded against its body, its eyes glowing like molten fire as it scanned the horizon. The dragon was a creature of legend, a beast that could level entire villages with a single roar. Its scales were black as night, glimmering in the fading light of the day. Elias approached cautiously, his heart racing, but he didn't show fear. Fear would not help him now. The dragon's eyes fixed on him, narrowing as it watched his every movement. The beast seemed to be studying him, weighing whether he was worth its attention. The wind carried the dragon's deep, rumbling growl to Elias's ears. It was a sound full of power, a warning. But Elias didn't flinch. He knew this moment would come, and he had prepared himself for it. When he reached the center of the open space, he stopped. He wasn't too far from the dragon, but close enough to be noticed. He took a deep breath, feeling the stillness around him. There was no need to speak yet. The dragon had to make the first move. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind and the steady thrum of Elias's heartbeat. Then, slowly, the dragon unfurled its wings. They were enormous, stretching across the sky as it leaped down from the cliff and landed with a ground-shaking thud. Dust and gravel scattered in all directions. Elias felt the heat radiating from the creature's massive body, but he stood firm. He couldn't show weakness now. The dragon took several slow steps forward, its eyes never leaving Elias. It circled him, its movements graceful yet intimidating. Elias kept his hands at his sides, not making any sudden movements. He had to remain calm. He had to stay steady. The dragon was testing him, just like the council had. When the dragon was directly in front of him, it stopped and let out a deep, rumbling growl. It was close enough that Elias could feel the heat from its breath, the power of its presence. For a moment, Elias simply stood there, breathing slowly, trying to focus. He remembered the first dragon he had encountered, the one that had allowed him to touch it, the one that had shown him that strength could come from understanding. Now was his chance to show the same thing to this beast. He spoke quietly, his voice calm but clear, carrying across the space between them. "I know you are strong. I know you've never been tamed by anyone, but I'm not here to try and control you. I'm here to understand you. I'm here to listen." For a moment, nothing happened. The dragon stared at him, its fiery eyes burning with intensity. Then, without warning, the dragon leaned down, its face inches from Elias's. He could feel its hot breath against his skin, and his pulse quickened, but he didn't move. He had to stay steady. This was the moment where everything could change. The dragon snorted, a plume of smoke escaping from its nostrils. It raised its head slightly, as if considering Elias's words. Elias stayed silent, waiting for the dragon to make its decision. He wasn't going to rush it. The dragon had to make the first move. The minutes stretched on. Then, to Elias's surprise, the dragon stepped back. It didn't growl or roar. It didn't attack. It simply took a few steps back, lowering its head as though in thought. Elias could hardly believe it. Was the dragon accepting him? Was it listening? His heart pounded in his chest, but he stayed calm. This was it. This was the moment where he could prove everything. He stepped forward, slowly, but without fear. "I'm here to be your ally, not your master." The dragon lowered its head even further, tilting it slightly as though it was considering his words. Then, for the first time, it let out a soft, rumbling sound. It wasn't a growl, but something else, something that almost sounded like approval. Elias took a step closer, his heart racing. Could it be? Could the dragon truly understand him? The beast moved its head slightly, nudging Elias gently with its snout. It wasn't violent, but it was firm, as if showing him that it was still in control. Soria had been watching from a distance, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had seen the dragon act violently towards so many others, but now she saw it interacting with Elias in a way she had never imagined. Elias reached out, slowly, and placed his hand on the dragon's snout. The warmth of its scales felt like fire, but it didn't recoil. Instead, it leaned into his touch. Soria watched in awe, her mouth slightly open. The dragon, once the most untamable creature in all of Drakari, was now accepting Elias. This was the moment that could change everything. The air was still as Elias stood in front of the great dragon, its massive form leaning into his hand. For the first time, the dragon didn't seem like a terrifying force of nature. Instead, it felt like something more, a creature capable of understanding, of forming a bond. Elias couldn't believe what he was witnessing. The dragon, once considered untamable, was now accepting him, not with aggression, but with something that felt like mutual respect. Soria had watched the entire exchange from a distance, her eyes wide in disbelief. She had never seen a dragon behave this way, not even with the Drakari. The thought that Elias had achieved something no one else had even dreamed of was both astonishing and deeply moving. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind, the soft rumble of the dragon's breath, and the steady rhythm of Elias's heart. He stood there, his hand still resting on the dragon's snout, feeling the warmth of its scales beneath his fingers. It was as if the creature was waiting for something more, waiting for Elias to prove that this connection was real, that it wasn't just a fleeting moment. Elias took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. He wasn't here to control the dragon. He wasn't here to force it into submission. He was here to show the Drakari that there was another way, a way where trust and respect could replace the old methods of domination. "I'm not your master," Elias said softly, his voice steady. "I'm here to be your ally. You don't have to fight anymore. We don't have to fight anymore." The dragon's eyes, glowing like embers, stared at him for a long moment. Then, it slowly pulled back, its massive head lifting as it regarded him with an expression that seemed almost curious. The tension in the air was palpable, but Elias didn't move. He kept his hand gently placed on the dragon's snout, steadying his breathing. Behind him, Soria took a cautious step forward, her voice trembling slightly. "Elias, do you think it's really listening? Can it truly understand what you're saying?" Elias turned slightly to look at her, his expression calm. "I think it is," he replied, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "It's not about speaking the same language. It's about showing that we're not enemies, that we're not here to hurt each other." The dragon took a step back, then another, its gaze still locked on Elias. The Cray Etcher seemed to be considering his words, contemplating something deep and ancient. The moment stretched on, as if time itself was holding its breath. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the dragon let out a low, deep sound, not a growl, but a low rumble that resonated through the ground. It was almost like a sigh, a sound that Elias couldn't quite explain. But it wasn't a threatening noise. It was almost peaceful. Soria's eyes widened. "It's agreeing with you?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. Elias nodded slowly. "I think so. I think it's trying to understand me, just like I'm trying to understand it." The dragon took another step back, then lowered its head. It seemed to be waiting for something, perhaps a sign that Elias truly meant what he had said. Elias didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his hand still resting gently on the dragon's snout, and spoke again, his voice calm but full of purpose. "I'm not here to take control of you. I'm here to help you. We can work together, you and I. We can show the world that strength doesn't have to come from fear. It can come from understanding." The dragon's massive wings fluttered slightly, then folded back against its body. It let out a soft exhale, and for a brief moment, Elias thought he saw a glimmer of something in its eyes, something that resembled trust. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Soria stepped forward, her voice shaking with awe. "I've never seen anything like this before," she said, her eyes fixed on the dragon. "The way it's reacting to you. It's like it's accepting you. It's listening." Elias didn't respond immediately. He was focused entirely on the dragon, feeling the connection growing between them. The dragon's behavior was unlike anything he had ever witnessed, and for a moment, he allowed himself to believe that it was possible to change the course of history, that this moment could mark the beginning of something new for both dragons and humans. The council had been watching from the cliffs above, and now they began to make their way down, their footsteps heavy against the rocky ground. Elias could hear their voices murmuring behind him, but he didn't turn around. This was his moment to prove to them, and to the world, that there was another way. When the council reached the clearing, the elder with the silver hair stepped forward. His eyes were intense, but there was something different in his gaze now. He studied Elias and the dragon carefully, as though trying to understand the impossible. "You have done what no one thought could be done," the elder said, his voice low but filled with awe. "The dragon, it is responding to you. It is listening." Elias nodded, his hand still on the dragon's snout. "I didn't force it to listen. I didn't try to control it. I just spoke to it. I showed it that we don't have to fight." The elder's eyes narrowed slightly, but this time there was no judgment in his gaze. "You have shown us something beyond what we thought possible. Perhaps it is time we reconsider our ways. Perhaps it is time to listen, as you have done." The other council members were silent, their faces filled with wonder. It was clear that they, too, were beginning to see what Elias had been trying to show them all along. That the old ways of domination and control didn't have to be the only path. Soria stepped forward, her voice quiet but full of conviction. "Elias has proven it. There's a new way forward. We don't have to fight anymore. We can learn to live together, humans and dragons. We can work together to build a future where both can thrive." The elder with the silver hair nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "Perhaps you are right. Perhaps it is time for a change." Elias looked back at the dragon, whose gaze was still fixed on him. He could see the trust in its eyes now, and it filled him with a sense of accomplishment and hope. They had done it. They had shown the world that a different way was possible. The bond between him and the dragon was only the beginning. It was the start of something bigger, a new era for both humans and dragons, one built on understanding, respect, and trust. And Elias knew that this was just the first step toward changing the world.